Chapter 1. The Postmistress's Tea. The morning mist over St. Mary Mellow had a particular quality in September, a thin grey shawl that clung to the hedgerows and softened the church spire into something half-remembered rather than seen, and it was in this hush, this suspended breath before the village properly woke, that Ivy Coombs let herself into Rose Cottage with the spare key she had used every Tuesday and Friday for 11 years, calling out her usual cheerful greeting to a silence that did not answer back. She found Agnes Pruitt in the garden, seated in the wicker chair beneath the apple tree, as though she had simply paused mid-thought to admire the last of the Michaelmas daisies. The tea beside her had gone quite cold, a delicate skin formed upon its surface, and her hands were folded in her lap with a composure that seemed, to the weeping Ivy and to the doctor who came shortly after, almost peaceful, the gentle unspooling of a long life reaching its natural end. Old Dr. Haydock, kindly and unhurried as ever, pronounced it the heart, as hearts of 78 years so often did, and the village, hearing the news over breakfast tables and shop counters, exhaled the particular sigh reserved for deaths that ask nothing difficult of the living. Poor Agnes! Well, she had a good long innings. It was into this soft, accepting grief that Miss Jane Marple arrived that afternoon, having walked the half-mile from her niece's house with her usual unhurried step, her basket over one arm, ostensibly to pay respects, but in truth, though she would not have phrased it so boldly, even to herself, because something in the manner of the telling had snagged, gently but persistently, at the back of her mind, the way a loose thread catches at wool. The front room of Rose Cottage had been arranged, with the swiftness village women achieve without ever seeming to hurry, into a place for mourners, chairs gathered close, the good china produced, small sandwiches under a damp cloth. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from the vicar's wife and settled herself in the corner with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned, over 8 decades, that rooms confess more to those who simply watch than to those who ask questions. And it was from this vantage, unremarkable, easily overlooked, precisely as she preferred, that she noticed the letter. It sat upon the vicar's small silver tray by the mantelpiece, where Dr. Haydock had apparently placed it after prizing it, with some tenderness, from Agnes's cold fingers. An old letter, by the look of it, the paper yellowed, the fold lines soft with age, the kind of correspondence one imagined tucked away in a drawer for decades and taken out only rarely, in moments of private reckoning. And yet, Miss Marple's gaze rested upon it a moment longer than politeness required, and something in her expression, had anyone thought to look, which no one did, sharpened almost imperceptibly, the way a cat's ear turns toward a sound too faint for its owner to notice. She rose, after a decent interval, to examine the little collection of framed photographs on the mantel, a perfectly ordinary thing for an elderly woman to do at a gathering of this kind, and in passing, quite naturally, allowed her attention to fall upon the letter itself. The wax seal, broken now, bore the ghost of a signet impression she did not recognize. But it was not the seal's design that troubled her. It was its smell. Beneath the parlour's mingled scents of lavender polish and fruitcake, and the particular mustiness of a cottage kept too long by an elderly woman, there was, faint but unmistakable to a nose that had spent a lifetime noticing what others did not, the sharp, resinous tang of fresh ink. Not the flat, aged must of decades-old iron gall, but something newer, something recently applied. A letter that looked 20 years old and smelled, very faintly, like yesterday. Miss Marple said nothing. She did not frown, did not lean closer, did not do anything at all that might have drawn a single eye toward her in that crowded, grieving little room. She simply continued her slow progression along the mantelpiece, admiring a photograph of Agnes as a young postmistress behind her counter, remarking softly to Mrs. Deacon on how well she had kept her figure, and when at last the vicar was called away to comfort a weeping Ivy Coombs by the door, and the small silver tray stood, for one unwatched moment, entirely alone, Miss Marple's hand, with the same unhurried, deniable grace with which she might have adjusted a stray pin in her cardigan, closed over the letter and drew it, quite without sound, into the depths of her handbag. She resumed her seat by the window a moment later, teacup in hand, expression one of gentle, unremarkable sorrow. An old woman among old women, mourning an old friend. But beneath the placid folds of her cardigan, her heart had begun, very quietly, to beat with the old and familiar quickening she had not felt in some years. The sense, unmistakable and never once wrong, that somewhere in this peaceful room someone was lying. Chapter 2. A Village in Mourning. Politely. The funeral of Agnes Pruitt took place on a Thursday morning beneath a sky the colour of unpolished pewter, the kind of low, breathless grey that seemed to press the whole village down into its ancient stones and make even the church bells sound muffled, reluctant, as though they too understood that grief, in St. Mary Mellow, was a thing to be conducted with the correct degree of restraint, and no more. Miss Marple arrived early, as was her habit, and took a seat toward the rear of St. Bartholomew's, not from any want of respect, but because a lifetime of quiet observation had taught her that the truest account of any gathering is written not upon the faces turned toward the coffin, but upon those who believe themselves unwatched. She settled into the cool shadow of a stone pillar, gloved hands folded over her prayer book, and let the church fill around her the way a tide comes in, slowly, then all at once. She noted, with the small private satisfaction of a woman cataloguing a garden, who came, and in what manner. Ivy Coombs arrived red-eyed and genuinely wretched, twisting a damp handkerchief between fingers roughened by years of scrubbing other people's grates. The deacons came together, the vicar composed in his professional sorrow, his wife's eyes darting once, briefly, toward the collection plate near the door, with an anxiety that seemed oddly disproportionate to a funeral. Young Tom Pruitt arrived 9 minutes late, his good suit a size too large across the shoulders, borrowed or bought in haste, his face carrying the grey, sleepless pallor of a man who has spent recent nights with figures rather than grief. And Rosalind Hartley slipped in, almost unnoticed, seating herself alone near the side aisle, her black gloves immaculate, her composure so perfectly maintained that Miss Marple found herself wondering, not unkindly, but with the reflexive curiosity of long habit, what precisely such careful composure was designed to hold in place. It was Colonel Gerald Whitmore, however, who commanded the room without appearing to seek it, as men of genuine or well-rehearsed authority so often do. He came in last, among the notable mourners, moving down the aisle with the unhurried, upright bearing of a man accustomed to being watched and entirely at ease with it, pausing to press Ivy Coombs's hand, to murmur something low and comforting to the weeping cleaning woman that made her sob afresh with gratitude. He was, Miss Marple thought, watching the small performance with the detached appreciation of a woman who had seen a great many performances in her time, a remarkably handsome man for 61, silver at the temples, the erect carriage of his old regiment still evident in the set of his shoulders, the sort of face that photographed well in the parish newsletter beside headlines about the summer fete. He delivered the eulogy, at the vicar's invitation, with the easy fluency of a man who had given a great many after-dinner speeches. He spoke of Agnes's decades behind the post office counter, her steady hand at the telegraph during the war years, her quiet kindness to the village's lonelier souls. Marple herself, he noted with a small, warm smile in her direction, being one who had corresponded with Agnes for years, and would surely miss her letters most keenly. It was by every measure the village would apply to it a lovely eulogy, warm, articulate, precisely the right length, and yet Miss Marple, listening with the stillness of a woman who had long ago learned that sincerity and eloquence were not the same coin, found herself troubled by something she could not, in that moment, have named. It was not what he said, it was the rhythm of it, the way each anecdote landed exactly where it ought, each pause held for precisely the breath a pause required. The whole performance possessed of a smoothness that suggested not memory recollected in grief, but a speech composed, revised, and rehearsed, perhaps more than once, before a mirror. A man does not usually polish his sorrow so carefully, she thought, folding her gloved hands more tightly in her lap, unless he is afraid of what might slip out if he did not. The thought troubled her enough that she watched him more closely still as the service drew toward its close, as the small procession formed to walk the coffin out to the churchyard beneath the old yew, its branches black and dripping faintly with the morning's earlier rain. She watched him step forward, as senior parishioner and old family friend, to lay his hand briefly upon the coffin's polished lid in the village's traditional gesture of farewell, a thing done 1,000 times before by 1,000 mourners, meaning nothing more than respect, than the simple animal need to touch what one is about to lose forever. But his hand, as it rested there, trembled. It was the smallest of things, a fine, fleeting tremor, gone almost before it had properly begun, the kind of motion that might in any other man, in any other moment, have been attributed to the cold, to age, to the ordinary weight of grief that visits even those who did not know the dead so very well. Miss Marple, from her position some 10 feet distant, saw it, because she had spent a lifetime seeing precisely such things. The tremor of a hand pressed flat against polished wood, the fractional widening of an eye, the half-second in which a carefully assembled face forgets, entirely, to hold its shape. And then it was gone. Gerald Whitmore withdrew his hand, drew himself upright with the smooth, practiced dignity of a man who has never once in his adult life allowed himself to be caught in disarray, and turned to offer his arm to Rosalind Hartley with a warmth so immediate, so perfectly restored, that Miss Marple might almost have believed she had imagined the whole of it. Almost. She stood a little apart from the graveside as the vicar spoke the final words, her eyes not upon the coffin now being lowered into the dark, waiting earth, but upon the Colonel's face, composed, solemn, grief arranged upon it with the same faultless precision as his eulogy had been arranged upon the air. A face, she thought, watching him accept condolences with his easy, practiced grace, that had learned very early in life, and very thoroughly, the exact cost of ever letting anyone see what lay beneath it. The mist had begun to lift by the time the mourners drifted back toward the lich gate, and somewhere behind her, unnoticed, unremarked, tucked safely within the lining of her handbag, the letter that smelled of fresh ink sat waiting, a small, silent weight that Miss Marple carried with her all the way home, turning over, again and again in her mind, the tremor of a hand that had touched a coffin, as though it were afraid of something the dead woman inside it might still, somehow, have to say. Chapter 3. The Letter's Secret. Miss Marple waited until evening to examine the letter properly, when her niece had retired with a headache, and the cottage had settled into the particular hush that only old houses seem to know how to keep. The creak of a settling beam, the faraway bark of a farm dog, the small ticking patience of a mantel clock counting out a silence that felt, that night, unusually full. She drew the curtains, though there was no one to see, and set the letter upon the little writing desk beneath the lamp, and for a long moment simply looked at it, unopened, the way one might look at a door one is not entirely certain one wishes to walk through. It was, she told herself, quite possibly nothing at all, an old woman's sentimental keepsake, taken up in her final hour for reasons known only to herself, its scent of fresh ink nothing more than a trick of a nose grown fanciful with age. And yet Miss Marple had lived a very long time, and had learned, over the accumulated weight of those years, that the mind's small persistent doubts were very rarely fanciful, and very often correct. She unfolded it with the care of a woman handling something both fragile and dangerous, and began, beneath the warm circle of lamplight, to read. The hand was a woman's, elegant but failing. The letters of the early lines formed with the confident, looping certainty of someone accustomed to fine stationery and careful correspondence, but growing, as the page progressed, increasingly uneven, the pen pressed too hard in places and too lightly in others, as though the writer's strength had been leaving her even as the words left the nib. "My dearest Agnes," it began, "I write this knowing I have not the courage to say it aloud, and perhaps not even the time remaining to try." And Miss Marple, reading on, felt the small cold settling in her chest that she recognized, from long experience, as the particular sensation of a truth about to surface, that someone, somewhere, had gone to very great lengths to keep submerged. The letter was Eleanor Hartley's. Miss Marple knew the name. Everyone in the district knew the name, the Hartleys having been the great family of the parish for the better part of 2 centuries. Their portraits still hung in the hall of what remained of the estate, their names still carved above the lich gate they had funded in some more prosperous generation. But this Eleanor wrote not as a great lady secure in her legacy, but as a dying woman confessing, in halting, anguished prose, a deception that had shaped an entire life not her own. The child was never Edmund's, the letter said. The ink here pressed so hard the nib had very nearly torn the paper, and I have let the world believe otherwise, for reasons that seemed, once, like mercy, and now seem only like cowardice. I cannot go to my grave and leave it so. Agnes, you have always been discreet, always been kind, and I ask of you now the last and hardest kindness I shall ever ask of anyone. See that he knows, not to punish him, only so that he might, at last, know himself. Miss Marple sat back slowly in her chair, the letter resting light as a held breath between her fingers, and felt the shape of the mystery shift and resettle around her like a room rearranged in darkness, familiar, and yet now entirely changed. A child, not of the blood he had been raised to believe was his own, a secret entrusted, 23 years past by the letter's dating, to a young postmistress known throughout the village for her discretion, a postmistress who had, by whatever failure of nerve or misplaced kindness, never delivered it. And who had, it seemed, only now, in the last days of her own life, with her own conscience perhaps growing as urgent and unbearable as Eleanor Hartley's had once been, decided at last to set the old wrong right. "I'm finally going to set something right," Agnes had told her, only the week before, over tea in this very cottage, with a lightness Miss Marple had taken then for simple contentment, the pleasant tidying up of an old woman's affairs. She had not pressed the remark. She rather wished, now, that she had. She turned her attention at last to the letter's superscription, the single line at its head, where Eleanor Hartley, in that same failing, urgent hand, must surely have written the name of the child, now a man, now walking somewhere in this village, with a life built entirely upon not knowing, or upon knowing and concealing, what this letter contained. And it was here, examining the top of the page beneath the full strength of the lamp, that Miss Marple went very still. The name was gone. Not faded, not lost to the natural erosion of 23 years' handling, but removed, scratched away with something sharp and deliberate, the paper's surface roughened and slightly torn where a blade or a fingernail had worked at the ink, until nothing remained but a pale, ragged wound in the page where a name had once stood. And beneath the strongest angle of the lamp's light, tilting the paper this way and that with the patient, unhurried precision of a woman who had spent decades noticing what others overlooked, Miss Marple could see that the edges of that scratching were clean, fresh. Not the soft yellow damage of old paper mishandled over decades, but the sharp white scoring of very recent work. Someone had held this letter in these last days or even hours, and had gone to the trouble, the frightened, meticulous trouble, of erasing the one piece of information that would have told the world, beyond all possible doubt, exactly whose life this secret belonged to. And yet they had not destroyed the letter itself, had not burned it, had not buried it, had not simply taken it and let it vanish as such things so often vanished in the quiet tragedies of village life. They had returned it, resealed, aged in appearance if not entirely in scent, name erased, to Agnes Pruitt's dying hand, as though hoping the world would read it precisely as the coroner had read her death. A sad, small, unremarkable ending, its true meaning safely, permanently unknowable. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly and set it down upon the desk, and sat for a long while in the lamplight without moving, turning over in her mind not the question of who the child might be, for she suspected, with the cold clarity of a woman assembling a pattern she did not yet wish to believe, that she already knew, but a colder question still. If someone had gone to such lengths to erase a name from a letter they dared not destroy, what exactly had they been willing to do to the woman who still, until her last breath, remembered it? Chapter 4. Old Threads, New Doubts. Offices of Pargeter and Finch, solicitors, occupied the ground floor of a narrow Georgian building on the market square, its brass plate polished to a dignified gleam that suggested a firm which had, for generations, handled the private griefs and quiet arrangements of families too respectable to air them elsewhere. Miss Marple presented herself there the following morning with a small, entirely plausible pretext concerning her own will. A matter of a codicil, she explained to the clerk, nothing urgent, though she wondered if young Mr. Pargeter might spare her a quarter of an hour, and was shown, after a decent interval, into an office smelling of leather bindings and pipe tobacco, where Mr. Pargeter the younger, a man of perhaps 50, with the careful, unhurried manner his profession seemed to cultivate in all its practitioners, rose to greet her. The matter of the codicil, once raised, was resolved with a speed that rather surprised the solicitor, and Miss Marple, with the artless ease of a woman whose conversation had never in 80 years followed a straight line, when a winding one would serve her better, allowed the discussion to drift, as such discussions so naturally do among the old, toward the sad business of poor Agnes Pruitt's passing, and from there, with scarcely a seam showing in the transition, toward the Hartley family, whose old estate papers, she believed, had once been handled by this very firm. "The Hartleys," Mr. Pargeter agreed, settling back with the faint, pleasant nostalgia solicitor's reserve, for families whose troubles have long since ceased to be current business. "Yes, indeed, though there's little of the estate left to speak of now. Old Edmund Hartley let it run down badly in his last years, and what remained went mostly to death duties. Sad thing, really. Grand old family once." "I understand," Miss Marple said, turning her teacup gently in its saucer, "that there was some question many years ago about the succession. Families do so often have their little complications, don't they? I recall my own grandmother never spoke to her sister above twice a year over a matter of a garden wall." Mr. Pargeter's smile flickered, very briefly, into something more careful. "There were the usual complications, I believe. Before my time, of course. My father handled the Hartley affairs in those days. There was a housemaid, I recall him mentioning once, a girl called Susan Yardley, I believe, who died quite young, not long after the birth of her own child. The boy was taken in and raised at the Hall, as was sometimes done in those days when a family felt a certain obligation, raised as one of their own, in point of fact, though never formally adopted. There was some talk at the time, as there always is in villages, but nothing was ever proven, and Edmund Hartley was not a man who welcomed questions on the subject." "And the boy," Miss Marple said, with the mild, wandering curiosity of a woman more interested in her tea than in the answer, "what became of him?" "Did well for himself, as it happens. Went into the army, as I understand it, came back some years later a colonel, married very respectably, and has been quite the pillar of the community ever since." You'll know him, I should think, living so near. Colonel Whitmore, up at Whitmore Hall." Miss Marple set down her teacup with a small, precise click against its saucer, and if her hand trembled at all in that moment, it was so slight a thing that even she, examining her own composure afterward with her customary honesty, could not have sworn to it. The pattern she had suspected since the previous evening's lamplight now stood before her not as suspicion but as near certainty, laid out as plainly as a hand of cards turned face up upon a table. And yet she found, to her mild surprise, that certainty brought her no satisfaction at all, only a deepening, sorrowful weight, the particular grief of watching a shape she had feared resolve itself fully into view. "How very interesting," she said, in the placid tone she reserved for observations she considered anything but placid. "It does seem remarkable, doesn't it, how thoroughly a person can become someone entirely other than where they began. I do wonder sometimes whether such things ever entirely settle in a person's own mind, or whether some small part always goes on wondering." Mr. Pargeter, who had clearly not expected his pleasant recollection of old village history to turn quite so philosophical, made a non-committal sound and reached for his own tea, and it was in the small silence that followed, the solicitor's attention momentarily elsewhere, his guard, such as it was, briefly lowered, that Miss Marple asked, with an idleness so perfectly rendered it might have fooled anyone in the room save herself, whether the old Hartley papers were still kept on file, in case a family member ever had cause to consult them. "Oh, they're all there," Mr. Pargeter said, gathering dust in the archive, mostly. No one's had reason to look at them in years. He paused then, and something crossed his face, a small furrow of recollection surfacing unbidden. "Odd thing, actually, now you mention it. Someone did come in and ask to see that very file, the Hartley succession papers, the old parish register copies, not a fortnight past. First time in, must be the better part of a decade." Miss Marple's expression did not change at all, though every faculty she possessed had in that instant sharpened to a fine and terrible point. "How curious," she said, with perfect mildness. "And might I ask who it was?" Mr. Pargeter frowned, reaching back through memory with the mild effort of a man for whom the request had been, at the time, entirely unremarkable. "Do you know, I can't rightly recall the name. My clerk handled it, not myself, and it was a quiet sort of request, nothing formal, no appointment even, just someone stopping in on their way through and asking to glance over the file for a few minutes before returning it. I could have my clerk look up the visitor's book, if it's of interest to you." "Please don't trouble yourself," Miss Marple said, rising with the unhurried grace of a woman for whom the conversation had reached its natural pleasant end, though within her the words had lodged themselves with the weight of struck iron. "Not a fortnight past. Someone had gone, quietly, without appointment, to look upon the very papers that would confirm or deny the parentage buried in Eleanor Hartley's failing hand, and had done so in the same narrow window of days in which Agnes Pruitt, after 23 years of silence, had decided at last to speak. She thanked Mr. Pargeter warmly for his time, gathered her gloves and her basket, and stepped out into the grey autumn light of the market square with the settled, sorrowful certainty of a woman who no longer doubted where this path led, only how far she would yet have to walk it, and how many more quiet, respectable lies she would have to peel away before she reached, Chapter 5. The Vicar's Quarrel. It was Mrs. Deacon who supplied the thread. As Miss Marple had rather suspected she might, over the tea and seed cake that followed the Women's Institute meeting on Wednesday afternoon, for Mrs. Deacon had never in her life been able to hold a piece of gossip for longer than the polite interval required to appear reluctant in the sharing of it, and the quarrel between her husband and poor Agnes Pruitt had by now ripened into precisely the sort of tale the village could not resist turning over in its collective hands. "Words were exchanged," Mrs. Deacon said, lowering her voice to the particular register reserved for scandal, too delicious to whisper and too delicate to speak aloud. Right there on the vicarage steps, not 10 days before she died. Agnes shouting, Agnes, if you can credit it, who I don't believe I ever once heard raise her voice in 30 years, and Henry white as a sheet afterward, wouldn't say a word about it all evening. Something about the Parish Restoration Fund, I believe, though he's never given me a proper account of it. Miss Marple received this intelligence with the mild, unhurried interest she brought to all such offerings, filing it away neither dismissed nor overweighted, for she had learned long ago that village quarrels came in a great many varieties, and that the loudest were very rarely the most dangerous. But a quarrel so near to the date of a death, however innocent its true cause might prove, was not a thread to be left hanging, and so it was that she called upon the vicarage the following afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the flowers for the coming harvest festival, and found Mr. Deacon alone in his study, looking, she thought, considerably less at ease than a man discussing chrysanthemums ought to look. He was a thin, earnest man, prematurely stooped from decades bent over parish accounts and sickbeds, with the particular exhausted kindness of a clergyman who has given rather more of himself to his flock than his flock has ever thought to return, and when Miss Marple, after the flowers had been settled, remarked with careful gentleness that she understood he and dear Agnes had exchanged some sharp words shortly before her passing, she watched the colour drain from his face with the swiftness of water from a cracked basin. "I wondered whether someone would come to it eventually," he said, and there was in his voice not the guarded defensiveness of a guilty man, but something closer to relief, the particular unburdening of a soul that has been carrying a small, shameful weight alone for too long. "I've thought of little else since she died, Miss Marple, and told myself it changes nothing, and yet—" He rose, went to the window, and stood a moment with his back to her, looking out over the churchyard where Agnes now lay beneath fresh-turned earth not 30 yards distant, and when he spoke again it was in the low, halting manner of a confession long rehearsed and never delivered. "I owed her money. There, it said. Not a great sum by the standards of grander men, but a great sum to me. £300, borrowed against the Restoration Fund 2 years past, when my mother was dying and the doctors in Bath wanted paying, and I hadn't the courage to write to the bishop and confess I couldn't manage on the stipend alone. Agnes lent it to me from her own savings, quietly, kindly, asking nothing but that I repay it when I could, and I have been repaying it, a little each quarter, though not nearly quickly enough for my own peace of mind. She asked for an accounting, the week before she died, grew sharp with me, rightly so, I dare say, for I'd been slow and evasive about the figures, ashamed to show her quite how little progress I'd made. I shouted back, "God forgive me," out of nothing but my own guilt, and she went away hurt, and I never had the chance to make it right before. His voice broke entirely there, and Miss Marple, watching him with the deep, unhurried compassion she reserved for genuine grief, as distinct from performed sorrow, saw in the trembling of his shoulders and the raw, unguarded wretchedness of his face nothing whatsoever of the calculated stillness she had observed in Colonel Whitmore's hand upon the coffin. This was a smaller sin, a human, ordinary sin of pride and shame and money owed, the kind of secret that weighed on a conscience precisely because it was so unremarkable, so far beneath the register of the crime she was in truth pursuing. "I don't believe," she said gently, "that a debt of £300, however keenly felt, is generally considered sufficient cause for murder, Mr. Deacon, and I should think your conscience might be permitted a little rest on that particular score, even if it insists on troubling you over the manner of your last conversation with her." He turned from the window then, and something in his exhausted, grateful face told her he had feared, all these days, that the village's suspicion might settle upon him with far graver implications than he could bear, and that her plain, unshocked acceptance of his small confession had lifted a weight he had not realized, until that moment, quite how heavily he had been carrying. "You don't think," he began, and could not finish it. "I think," Miss Marple said, rising and gathering her gloves, "that guilt is a peculiar thing, Mr. Deacon, and very often attaches itself most fiercely not to our gravest failings, but to our smallest ones, the unkind word, the debt unpaid, the moment of temper we cannot take back, precisely because the person we spoke it to is no longer here to forgive us for it. I shouldn't think you had any hand at all in Agnes's death, but I do wonder," and here her tone, though it remained perfectly mild, took on the faint, deliberate weight she reserved for questions she considered genuinely important, whether, in that same conversation, or in the days surrounding it, Agnes gave you any indication that she had some other, weightier matter on her mind. "Something beyond parish accounts." Mr. Deacon frowned, casting his memory back with the effort of a man now eager to be of use, to redeem in information what he could not redeem in money. "Now that you mention it, yes, there was something," she said, almost in passing, as she was leaving, still cross with me, that she'd soon have a weight off her own conscience too, and that some debts couldn't be settled with money, only with the truth, however late it came. He shook his head slowly. "I took it as a general remark, the kind old people make, thinking of their own mortality. I didn't think to ask her meaning." Miss Marple stood very still in the vicarage study, the autumn light falling grey, and even through the tall window, and felt the last small doubt she had permitted herself regarding the vicar's innocence settle quietly into certainty, and felt, too, with a colder and more urgent clarity than before, the shape of Agnes Pruitt's final days come into sharper, more tragic focus. An old woman moving through her ordinary week, snapping at a vicar over unpaid debts, tending her garden, pouring her tea, all the while carrying within her the far greater weight of a 23-year silence she had finally, irrevocably, resolved to break. And never once suspecting, Miss Marple thought with a sorrow that surprised her in its sharpness, that the truth she meant to deliver so late would arrive, for her, far too late indeed. Chapter 6. The cat left out Rose Cottage stood empty now, save for its small collection of dust-sheeted furniture and the accumulated silence of a life recently ended, and it was there that Miss Marple returned on a still, colourless afternoon the following week, having secured from young Tom Pruitt, grateful, harried, still faintly bewildered by the sudden business of inheritance, a key and a distracted blessing to have a look round for anything of Aunt Agnes's you might like as a keepsake. Miss Marple, she was always fond of you. She let herself in through the kitchen door and stood a moment in the cool, close quiet of the little house, breathing in its particular smell of beeswax and old books, and the faint, lingering sweetness of dried lavender that Agnes had always kept in bowls upon the window-sills, and felt, as she so often did in the homes of the recently dead, the peculiar sensation of a life's small habits still hanging in the air, undisturbed, waiting for a hand that would never again come to disturb them. It was the cat that had troubled her, in truth, more than she had admitted even to herself in the days since the funeral. A small, seemingly trivial detail that Ivy Coombs had mentioned in passing, tearfully, as though it were merely one more sad note in a generally sad tale, and yet which had lodged itself in Miss Marple's mind with the particular persistence she had learned, over 80 years, never to dismiss. Found the poor thing shut out in the cold, mewing something pitiful at the back door, and Agnes never once in all the years I've known her left that cat out overnight, not even in high summer. Fair doted on him, she did. Miss Marple made her way now to that same back door, and stood examining it with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman for whom no domestic detail was ever beneath consideration, and found, as she had rather expected to find, nothing remarkable in the door itself. No forced lock, no splintered frame, nothing to suggest violence in the ordinary sense. But a door need not be forced, she reflected, if the person who came through it was known, and welcomed, and offered tea before ever the question of harm arose. She turned her attention next to the small sitting-room grate, cold now and swept, as it had not been on the morning of Agnes's death, by Ivy Coombs's dutiful hand in the days since. And here Miss Marple felt the first true quickening of that particular certainty she had learned to trust above all her other faculties. For Ivy, in her grief and her thoroughness, had swept the ashes into the small tin bucket kept beside the hearth for precisely that purpose, and had not yet, in the disordered days since the funeral, thought to empty it, and it was here, crouching with some effort but no complaint beside the cold grate, sifting through the pale, fragile ash, with the careful patience of a woman who had spent a lifetime finding significance in what others discarded, that Miss Marple found it. A corner of paper, not fully consumed, heavier stock than ordinary writing paper, cream-coloured beneath its char, the kind of fine, expensive stationery that spoke immediately of a particular sort of household, one where such things were bought by the ream from London stationers rather than the village shop. She lifted it with the greatest delicacy, cradling it in her palm as one might cradle something living and fragile, and turned it toward the grey light from the window. The greater part of the corner had burned away entirely, curling to blackened ash that crumbled at the lightest touch, but a small triangle of the paper's edge had survived the flame, scorched brown but legible, and upon it, embossed faintly into the heavy stock in a manner that spoke of old money and older pretension, was the unmistakable curve of a crest, a hawk, wings raised, clutching in its talons what appeared, even in that small ruined fragment, to be a sheaf of wheat. Miss Marple had seen that crest before. She had seen it, in fact, only the previous week, carved in weathered stone above the lich gate that the Hartley family had funded some 3 generations past, and again upon the spine of an old estate ledger she had glimpsed, quite by chance, resting upon Mr. Pargeter's shelf during her visit to the solicitor's office, the Hartley crest. Burned, deliberately and recently, in the grate of a woman who had died clutching a decades-old letter whose original addressee had been just as deliberately, just as recently, scratched away. She sat back upon her heels, the small scorched fragment resting in her open palm, and felt the pieces of the pattern draw together with a clarity that brought her no comfort whatsoever. Someone had come to this cottage, someone known well enough to be admitted without alarm, familiar enough that the cat, ordinarily so contentedly indoors, had been shut out perhaps in some struggle, some hurried movement, that had sent the animal fleeing through a door left carelessly ajar, and that someone had brought with them, or found here already, paper bearing the Hartley crest, paper that had then been burned, its ashes swept unwittingly into a tin bucket by a grieving cleaning woman who had never thought to wonder why her mistress, who wrote her few remaining letters upon plain cottage stationery, should have had any occasion at all to burn something so fine. Miss Marple rose slowly, her knees protesting the effort, and stood a long moment in the cold, quiet sitting-room, turning the small scorched fragment over in her fingers as though it might, given sufficient patience, tell her the rest of what it knew. The cat wound itself about her ankles just then, having crept in through the open door behind her, and pressed its small, warm body against her stockinged leg with the plaintive, uncomprehending affection of a creature that had lost, without any capacity to understand why, the one person in the world who had loved it best. And Miss Marple, bending with some difficulty to stroke its head, felt the sorrow of the moment settle over her with unexpected weight. A staged piece, she thought, looking once more about the tidy, undisturbed little room, at the wicker chair still standing beneath the apple tree beyond the window where Agnes had been found so composed, so seemingly at rest. A death arranged to look like nothing at all, and very nearly successful in the arranging. Whoever had sat with Agnes Pruitt in her final hour had taken great care, it seemed, to leave behind a scene of perfect, peaceful, unremarkable ending, and had overlooked, in that care, only the small, stubborn things that a house remembers when its mistress cannot. A cat shut out in the cold, and a fragment of fine paper that had refused, in the end, to burn quite all the way to nothing. Chapter 7. Rosalind's Grief. Rosalind Hartley lived alone in a small, ivy-throttled house at the edge of the village that had once, Miss Marple understood, been the dower house of the greater Hartley estate, and which now stood as the last true remnant of that family's fading grandeur. A genteel diminishment reflected everywhere in its worn Turkish carpets, its silver gone soft and unpolished at the edges, its rooms too large and too cold for the single occupant who kept them. Miss Marple came calling on the pretext of returning a book of pressed wildflowers Rosalind had once lent to her niece, and was received in a small morning room where a fire had been lit against the autumn chill, though it did little, Miss Marple observed, to warm the atmosphere of careful, watchful reserve with which her hostess greeted her. Rosalind was a slight, fine-boned woman of perhaps 45, with the particular beauty that comes to some women only in the diminishing of youth, when the bones of the face emerge more clearly and the eyes, no longer distracted by softer prettiness, become the whole of what one notices, and Miss Marple noticed, within moments of taking her seat, that those eyes were red-rimmed and shadowed in the manner of a woman who has wept, recently and often, in private. "You knew Agnes well, I think," Miss Marple said, once the tea had been poured and the pleasantries of the wildflower book exhausted, better perhaps than most in the village realized. Something moved behind Rosalind's careful composure. Not alarm exactly, but a kind of weary resignation. The look of a woman who has been expecting a particular question for some time and has simply been waiting, with diminishing hope, for it never to come. "She was kind to me," Rosalind said quietly, "when I was young, and the world was rather unkind. My mother died when I was 12, and my father was not a man given to warmth, whatever his other virtues, and Agnes, at the post office, always had a moment for a lonely girl, a kind word, a sweet from the jar she kept for the children." Her hand, Miss Marple noticed, trembled very slightly as she lifted her own teacup. "I shall miss her more than most people would credit." "I understand," Miss Marple said, with the gentle, unhurried directness she reserved for moments requiring it, "that you stand to have rather more than sentiment at stake, should certain old matters of the Hartley estate ever come to be reconsidered. As the last of the true blood, I mean." The teacup rattled, this time unmistakably, against its saucer, and Rosalind set it down with the exaggerated care of a woman whose hands are no longer entirely to be trusted. "You know, then," she said, very low, "about Gerald." "I have begun to suspect a great deal," Miss Marple said, "though I confess I do not yet know the whole of it. And I should be very grateful, my dear, if you would help me understand what you do." And it came then, in halting pieces, the story Rosalind Hartley had evidently been carrying alone for a very long time, how her father, in his last bitter years, had let slip more than once, in his cups, dark hints about the Whitmore boy and what he was not entitled to, hints Rosalind had never fully understood until, some years past, she had come upon old family correspondence suggesting the truth of Gerald's parentage, and had said nothing, done nothing, told no one. For what use would it have served, she asked Miss Marple with sudden, raw honesty, beyond destroying a man's whole life and gaining herself an estate that was, by then, worth rather more in duties owed than in land held? "I did not want it," she said, and there was something in the plain, exhausted force of the statement that convinced Miss Marple entirely of its truth. "I have thought, God forgive me, that I would rather let the lie stand than be the one who unmade it." "Is that so very terrible?" "I don't believe wanting peace is terrible," Miss Marple said gently. "But I wonder, my dear, whether there is something else troubling you just now, something rather nearer to hand than an old family secret." Rosalind's composure, already thin, gave way entirely then, and she wept, not the performed grief of the funeral, but something rawer, more frightened, the tears of a woman who has been holding herself together by main force and can no longer manage it. "There is someone," she said finally, into her handkerchief. "A man, in Bath, married, I'm ashamed to say, though unhappily, and it has been going on above a year now, and if it were ever known, I should be ruined twice over, once for the estate and once for that. I have been so afraid, Miss Marple, so dreadfully afraid these past weeks, that someone had learned of it and might— She stopped herself, pressing the handkerchief hard against her mouth, as though to physically restrain the rest of the sentence. Might what, my dear? Might have told Agnes, Rosalind whispered. She wrote to me, you see, not 10 days before she died. A strange little note, asking whether we might talk, whether there was something I ought to know before it was too late to know it. I never went. I was too afraid it was about him, about Bath, and I could not bear to hear it from her lips, of all peoples, so I put it off, and now she is dead, and I shall never know what she meant to tell me, and I have been half out of my mind since, wondering if my own cowardice had some part in— She broke off entirely, unable to finish, and Miss Marple, watching this fresh, unguarded collapse, understood with sudden and complete clarity that whatever secrets Rosalind Hartley carried, they were secrets of the heart and not of murder. A woman's private shame magnified by grief into an imagined guilt that had nothing whatever to do with the truth of Agnes's death. You must not torment yourself so, Miss Marple said, reaching across to press the younger woman's trembling hand with a gentleness that carried its own quiet reassurance. I do not believe your silence killed her, my dear, whatever burden your own conscience insists on placing there. But I wonder— and here her voice, though still soft, took on the deliberate weight of a question long withheld— whether Agnes's note to you mentioned any other name, anyone else she might have been intending to speak with, before or after yourself, on this same troubling matter. Rosalind lifted her tear-streaked face, and something in her expression shifted, not toward relief, but toward a fresh and dawning unease, as though a thought long suppressed had finally forced its way to the surface. There was one thing, she said slowly, that I hadn't thought to mention, because it seemed so small at the time. She wrote that she meant to call at Whitmore Hall that same week, to see the Colonel on what she called an old matter between old friends. Rosalind's hand tightened suddenly around Miss Marple's own. I never thought anything of it. Gerald and Agnes had known each other the whole of their lives. But now that you ask it so directly, Miss Marple, I find I cannot recall her ever mentioning any particular fondness for him at all. Only a kind of watchfulness, now I come to think of it. As though she'd been keeping an eye on him for a very long time, and had finally decided the watching was done. Chapter 8. The Slow Church Clock. The vestry of St. Bartholomew's kept, among its other small parish records, a battered leather ledger in which the choirmaster, old Mr. Fenwick, dutifully noted the attendance of his little choir at each Thursday practice, a habit born less of necessity than of a lifetime's clerical instinct, the same instinct that led him to note the weather each Sunday in the margins of his hymn sheets. And it was to this ledger that Miss Marple turned her attention on a cold, bright morning, some days after her conversation with Rosalind Hartley. Having secured Mr. Fenwick's cheerful and entirely unsuspecting cooperation on the pretext of confirming the date of a long-ago carol service for a piece of parish history she claimed to be compiling. Whitmore, Mr. Fenwick murmured, running a thick finger down the columns of his own careful hand. Here we are. The Thursday in question, yes. Arrived a little after the half-hour, I recall. Apologized very handsomely for it, too. said he'd been detained on estate business. Good baritone, the Colonel, when he troubles to attend regular. A little after the half hour, Miss Marple repeated, with the mild, encouraging interest of a woman merely confirming a pleasant detail. And practice began, as always, at 7. As always, by the church clock, Mr. Fenwick agreed, and then, warming further to a subject evidently dear to him, added, "Though I don't mind telling you, Miss Marple, that clock gave us no end of trouble that particular week. Ran slow, you see, a full half-hour slow, near enough, until young Davies from the ironmonger's came up and set it right the following Monday. I remember, because we near lost poor Mrs. Fenwick's solo entirely, everyone arriving by their own watches and the church clock telling quite a different story." Miss Marple sat very still for a moment in the cool, dust-mote silence of the vestry, feeling the small, cold click of a lock turning somewhere deep within the pattern she had been so patiently assembling these past weeks. A clock, half an hour slow. A Colonel arriving by that same slow clock, a little after the half hour, which meant, by any true and honest reckoning, that Gerald Whitmore had not entered the church until very nearly 8 o'clock, a full hour after choir practice properly began, and a full hour in which his whereabouts, so comfortably assumed by the whole village to have been accounted for, in fact remained entirely, damningly unknown. An hour was more than sufficient, she reflected, with a sorrow that did nothing to slow the clear, cold progress of her reasoning, to walk from Whitmore Hall to Rose Cottage, to sit a while over tea with an old friend, and to walk back again, unhurried, unremarked, in the gathering dusk of an autumn evening when the village's attention was safely gathered elsewhere, in a church whose own clock had, for one crucial week, told a comfortable and convenient lie. She thanked Mr. Fenwick warmly, praised his admirable thoroughness as a record-keeper, and made her way out into the churchyard, where the true clock, corrected now, ticking with honest precision above the porch, showed a little past 11, and stood there a moment in the thin autumn sunlight, gathering herself before the next and harder piece of the pattern she meant to confirm. It was Dr. Haydock she called upon next, finding him in his surgery between patients, willing as ever to indulge what he took to be an old friend's idle curiosity. And it was there, over the small ceremony of tea he always insisted upon, regardless of the hour, that Miss Marple raised, with careful casualness, the question of the small mark she had noticed, or thought she had noticed. She added, with the self-deprecating uncertainty of an old woman who did not entirely trust her own eyes these days, upon poor Agnes's wrist, in the moments before the coffin was closed. Dr. Haydock's easy manner sobered somewhat, though not, she was relieved to note, with any suspicion of her purpose, but with the simple professional recollection of a man reviewing his own work. "You've a sharper eye than most, Miss Marple, I'll say that for you. There was a mark, yes, a bruise, faint, along the inner wrist, here." He touched his own arm to demonstrate. "The sort of thing I'd generally put down to arthritis, or a fall, in a woman of Agnes's age. She'd complained of stiffness in that wrist before, as it happens, so it seemed the natural conclusion, and there being no other sign of violence upon her, no struggle, no disturbance to speak of, I saw no cause to look further. Heart failure explains a great deal in the elderly. It generally does. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, a bruise of that particular kind, I wonder, Dr. Haydock, whether it mightn't equally have come from a hand gripping the wrist rather firmly, to hold it still, perhaps, while a cup was pressed to unwilling lips. The doctor's cup paused halfway to his mouth, and he regarded her for a long moment with the sharpened attention of a professional man confronted, gently but unmistakably, with the possibility of his own error. "You're suggesting she was made to drink something," he said slowly. "Forced, or persuaded, against her better judgment." "I am suggesting only that an old woman's heart, already weakened by age, might be persuaded to fail rather more suddenly than nature alone would have arranged it," Miss Marple said. "If something were added to soften its resistance, a preparation from a doctor's own dispensary, say, or a chemist's, easily obtained by a man of standing and no questions asked, and easily mistaken, afterward, for the ordinary and expected failure of a heart that had, after all, seen 78 years of service." Dr. Haydock set down his cup with the careful stillness of a man recalculating, in real time, the whole of a conclusion he had signed his name to with confidence, and said, after a long pause, that he would, if she thought it truly warranted, request a fuller examination, quietly, discreetly, before the matter went any further, though he could make her no promises as to what, if anything, so many days after burial, might still be found to confirm it. Miss Marple thanked him and took her leave, and walked from the surgery not toward her niece's house, but toward the church, drawn there by some instinct she did not fully examine until she found herself once more standing alone beneath its cool stone arches, before the tall clock face that had, for one convenient week, told a lie precise enough to shelter a murderer within its slow, forgiving hands. She stood there a long while in the empty, listening silence, the autumn light falling grey and patient through the high windows, and understood, at last, with the full and sorrowful weight of certainty, the exact shape of what Gerald Whitmore had done, and the exact, terrible lengths to which a man might go, when the truth he feared was not merely the loss of land or title, but the unmaking of the only self he had ever permitted himself to become. Chapter 9. The Colonel's Mask Slips. The invitation to Whitmore Hall, when it came, arrived by Miss Marple's own quiet engineering. A note sent round suggesting she might, in her capacity as one of the parish's oldest residents, be able to offer some small guidance on the historical arrangement of the church flowers for the harvest festival, a matter she understood the Colonel, as senior churchwarden, took a personal interest in each year. Gerald Whitmore, ever the gracious host, replied within the day with an invitation to tea, and Miss Marple accepted with the placid gratitude of a woman entirely absorbed in matters of chrysanthemums and Michaelmas daisies, giving no outward sign whatsoever that she walked up the long gravel drive that afternoon, carrying, folded carefully within her handbag, a great deal more than flower arrangements. The hall itself struck her, as she was shown through its cool, high-ceilinged rooms, as a house maintained with the particular, almost anxious perfection of a man determined that nothing within his domain should ever be found wanting, the brass polished to a brightness that seemed almost aggressive, the portraits of long-dead Hartleys, arranged along the staircase with a precision that suggested they had been measured with a ruler, the whole house possessed of the immaculate, breathless order of a stage set dressed for a performance that never quite stopped being given. Gerald received her in the drawing-room with all his customary warmth, rising to greet her with both hands extended, remarking with genuine seeming pleasure on how seldom he had the privilege of her company. And Miss Marple, settling into the chair he drew out for her, allowed herself, for a moment, the small and rather melancholy observation that he truly was, on the surface of things, everything a village could wish for in its most prominent citizen: attentive, generous, quick with a compliment and quicker still with a kindness, and felt, not for the first time in her long career of unmasking such men, the particular sorrow of watching a genuinely charming performance given by a man she now knew, beyond any reasonable doubt, to be a murderer. They spoke first, as arranged, of flowers, of the merits of dahlias over chrysanthemums for the harvest table, of the year-old Mrs. Ferris had insisted on marrows as a centerpiece to general parish dismay, and Miss Marple let the conversation wander pleasantly along these safe channels for the better part of 20 minutes, watching Gerald pour the tea with his easy, practiced hospitality, before she began, with the gentle, meandering indirection that was her particular art, to steer them toward more dangerous ground. "You had rather an unusual upbringing, I understand," she said, with the mild, wondering curiosity of an old woman recalling half-remembered village history, "raised here at the Hall, though I believe your own dear mother was in service, was she not? It always strikes me as remarkable, the different paths a life can take, depending entirely on which door happens to be left open to a child, and which closed." She watched, with the close, unhurried attention she brought to all such moments, the small shift that crossed his face, nothing so crude as alarm, for Gerald Whitmore had clearly spent a lifetime perfecting his composure against exactly this sort of inquiry, but a fractional tightening about the eyes, a stillness that settled over him like a held breath. "My mother died when I was very young," he said, his voice carefully even. "The Hartleys were kind enough to take me in and raise me as their own. I owe them a debt I could never properly repay." "How very fortunate," Miss Marple said, "that they should have felt so strongly the obligation. Not every family, I think, would have gone to such lengths, for a child not strictly of their blood." She let the observation sit a moment, in the warm, firelit air between them, watching him with the placid, patient attention of a woman merely making conversation, and added, as though the thought had only just occurred to her, "Though I do wonder, Colonel, whether a child raised so, given everything, and yet always knowing, in some small unspoken corner of himself, that it was given rather than owed, doesn't carry that knowledge with him his whole life through, however well it's hidden." The teapot, which Gerald had lifted to refill her cup, paused very slightly in the air, and when he set it down again, it was with a precision that struck Miss Marple as entirely too careful, the movement of a man exerting deliberate control over hands that wished, very badly, to do something else entirely. "I'm not certain I take your meaning, Miss Marple," he said, and his voice, though still pleasant, had lost some fraction of its warmth, had grown instead the polished, careful evenness of a man picking his way across ground he suspects may not bear his weight. "Only that I've always found," Miss Marple went on, with the same soft, relentless gentleness, "that the things we're given, rather than born, to have a way of feeling less like foundations than like loans, debts we go on paying, in one coin or another, our whole lives through, terrified always of the day the bill might be called in. I imagine a man in such a position might come to feel, over time, that his whole self depended on no one ever presenting that bill, that he had, in a sense, built his entire house upon a single locked door, and could not bear the thought of anyone ever finding the key. The silence that followed this was of a different order entirely than any that had come before it in their conversation. A silence in which Miss Marple could hear, quite distinctly, the small crackle of the fire and the tick of the mantel clock, and beneath it all, the strained, unsteady rhythm of Gerald Whitmore's breathing. And when she looked up from her tea to meet his eyes directly, she saw there, for the first time, something entirely unguarded. Not anger, not yet, but a raw and naked fear, so deep and so old it seemed to reach back past the man before her, into the frightened, uncertain boy he must once have been, standing in a grand house that was not truly his, learning very early and very thoroughly the exact cost of ever letting that uncertainty show. "I think," Gerald said, and his voice now shook very slightly, the careful polish of it fracturing at last, "that you had better tell me plainly, Miss Marple, what it is you imagine you know." But Miss Marple, who had spent a very long lifetime learning precisely when to press and when to withdraw, only smiled, mild and unhurried, and remarked that she had perhaps let an old woman's fanciful musings run rather too far afield, and that she really must be getting back before the light failed entirely, and rose to gather her things with such perfect, unbothered composure that Gerald had no choice but to rise also. To see her to the door with the automatic courtesy long habit demanded of him, though his hand, as he reached to ring for the tea things to be cleared, trembled so visibly against the silver bell that it rang twice, sharp and discordant, before he could still it. The same fine, betraying tremor she had first glimpsed upon a coffin lid now returned in full and unmistakable force. He said nothing further as he walked her to the door, offered no more warm parting pleasantries, and Miss Marple, stepping out into the cooling gold of the late afternoon, understood with complete and sorrowful certainty that she had, at last, found the truth she had been seeking, and understood, too, with the colder clarity of long experience, that certainty alone would never be sufficient to bring a man like Gerald Whitmore to account, and that somewhere between this moment and the truth's final reckoning lay one more piece still missing, without which all her patient observation would count, in the eyes of the law, for nothing at all. Chapter 10. The Letter That Was Never the Letter. The final piece came to Miss Marple, as the truest pieces so often did, not through deduction, but through the small, patient kindness of an ordinary woman going about her ordinary work. For it was Mrs. Latimer, who kept the post office in the neighbouring village of Netherfold, some 3 miles distant by the field path, who mentioned to Miss Marple's niece, in the course of an entirely unrelated errand, that she had been so surprised, the week before poor Agnes Pruitt died, to see her old friend and former colleague walk all that way on her own 2 feet to post a letter. And such care she took over it too, asking me twice whether I was quite certain it would go safely, and registered, mind, which she paid extra for without a murmur, though Agnes was never one to spend a farthing she didn't have to. Miss Marple, hearing this second-hand account over her niece's supper table, set down her fork with the particular stillness of a woman for whom a great many scattered threads have just drawn themselves, all at once, into a single clear and terrible pattern, and asked, as calmly as she could manage, whether Mrs. Latimer had happened to notice the direction the letter was addressed. She had not. But she recalled, with the unhurried helpfulness of village memory, that it had gone to London, somewhere in the legal quarter, I believe, for I remarked upon the address myself, being unusual for Agnes, who never had cause to write to solicitors in my experience, and Miss Marple, sitting very still in the lamplight of her niece's dining room, understood at last the full and aching shape of what Agnes Pruitt had done in the last days of her life, and why. She had not trusted the village to keep her secret safe, not the vicar, not the doctor, not even, perhaps, her own resolve, weakened as it might be by a lifetime's habit of discretion, the moment she found herself face to face with the man she meant to expose. And so, with the quiet, methodical courage of a woman who had spent decades weighing exactly how much trust any secret deserved, she had walked 3 miles to a village where no one knew her business, and had posted, under registered seal, to a London solicitor entirely outside the reach of St. Mary Mellow's comfortable silences, the true and original letter, Eleanor Hartley's full confession, name intact, addressed and delivered at last to precisely the authority that could not be pressured, nor persuaded, nor quietly made to disappear. The letter Gerald Whitmore had returned to her dying hand, resealed, and its name erased, had never been the danger at all. It had been, Miss Marple understood now with a sorrow so sharp it very nearly stole her breath, a decoy, perhaps taken by Gerald himself from among Agnes's papers in some earlier searching visit, kept as insurance, or perhaps genuinely believed by him to be the only copy in existence. He had killed a gentle, guilt-ridden old woman to silence a secret that had, by the time he pressed the cup to her unwilling lips, already escaped him entirely, already begun its own quiet, unstoppable journey toward London and the light. She did not sleep well that night, and in the grey hour before dawn, dressing by lamplight with the deliberate care of a woman preparing for something she would rather not do but knew could not be postponed, Miss Marple resolved that the reckoning, when it came, would come gently, not because Gerald Whitmore deserved gentleness, but because she had learned, across a very long life of watching such men unmasked, that the truth delivered with cruelty rarely served justice any better than the truth withheld. She found him in his garden, as she had somehow known she would, standing at his own front gate in the pale, washed light of early morning, dressed with his usual immaculate care for the 8 o'clock service, his prayer book beneath his arm, the very picture of a respectable man beginning a respectable day. He saw her approaching along the lane, and something in his face, already, she thought, a little grey, a little worn beneath its careful arrangement, as though sleep had been as unkind to him these past nights as it had to her, told her that some part of him had been expecting this arrival for some days now, perhaps since the moment his hand had trembled against the silver bell in his own drawing-room. "Miss Marple," he said, and his voice, though he clearly strove to keep it even, carried the faint, betraying strain of a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. "You're abroad very early." "So are you, Colonel," she said, coming to stand before him at the gate, her hands folded quietly over her basket, her voice as mild and unhurried as it had ever been in all their acquaintance. "I wonder whether we might speak a moment, before the bells call you to church. There is something I think you already know, I mean to say, and I should rather say it to you directly than have it said, later, by others less kindly disposed." He did not answer at once. He stood very still at his own gate, in the thin gold light, and something in the careful stillness of him reminded her, with an ache she had not expected, of the tremor she had first glimpsed upon a coffin lid. The small, human crack in a mask worn so long and so thoroughly that its wearer had very nearly forgotten there was a face beneath it. "She wrote it all down again, didn't she?" he said finally, and it was not a question. "The real letter. She sent it away somewhere I couldn't reach it." "She did," Miss Marple said gently. "To a solicitor in London, registered and safe, some days before you came to her that evening, with the letter you believed to be the only one, and the tea you had prepared, and the persuasion you brought with it to soften a heart already tired with age. I imagine you meant only to frighten her at first, to ask her one final time to let an old silence lie. But she would not be moved, would she? Not this time, not after 23 years of watching you build a life on a foundation she alone knew to be false." Gerald's face, in the grey morning light, seemed suddenly to age a decade in the space of a breath, the careful composure of 61 years dissolving into something rawer, more exposed. Not the face of the village's most admired colonel, but of a frightened boy who had spent his entire life running from a truth he could never quite outdistance. "You don't know what it is," he said, low and shaking, "to grow up in a house where you are given everything, the name, the education, the standing, and never once told outright why, only made to feel, in 1,000 small unspoken ways, that you were tolerated rather than truly claimed. I built this life, Miss Marple, every part of it, the regiment, the marriage, this house, this parish. I earned every ounce of respect I hold in this village, and I was not about to let one old woman's failing conscience unmake it all in an afternoon, over a sin that was never mine to begin with. My mother's shame, not mine. Why should I have paid for it my whole life, and then paid for it again with everything I'd built? Because, Miss Marple said, with a gentleness that somehow carried more weight than any accusation could have done, you had already, in your own heart, decided that the life you built was worth more than the life you took. And I think, Colonel, if you are honest with yourself in this last quiet moment before the world learns what you've done, you know that is the true tragedy of it. Not that the secret existed, for secrets of that kind are as old as families themselves, and the world is generally kinder to them than we fear. The tragedy is that you might have lived out your days respected and loved, regardless of the truth, had you only trusted the village to love the man rather than the myth. Agnes did not write that letter to destroy you. She wrote it, in the end, because she could no longer bear to watch you live a lie she alone had the power to end, and because she believed, rightly I think, that a man cannot ever truly know himself, or be truly at peace, while standing upon ground he knows to be false. Gerald's hands, gripping the top rail of his own garden gate, had gone white at the knuckle, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost entirely the smooth, practiced warmth the village had known him by for 30 years, replaced by something raw and exhausted and, at last, entirely honest. I didn't mean for her to die. I meant only to frighten her into silence. A draught in her tea. Nothing more. Something to make her drowsy and pliable. To buy myself time to think. I never meant—" He stopped, his composure finally, completely breaking, and Miss Marple watched a man's whole carefully constructed self collapse, there in the morning light, at his own gate, dressed for church. "I know," she said softly. "I don't believe you set out that morning intending murder, Colonel. I believe you set out intending only to protect the man you had spent your whole life becoming, and found too late that some protections cost more than any of us can truly afford to pay. But intent, however genuinely felt, cannot restore what was taken from Agnes Pruitt, nor absolve what your own hand did in that quiet garden. That, I fear, is a reckoning you must now make with rather graver authorities than myself." He did not run. She had somehow known, watching the slow collapse of his composure, that he would not, that a man who had spent his entire life so desperately maintaining appearances would not, in the end, choose the final, ultimate disgrace of flight. He simply stood there at his gate, in his good church suit, his prayer book still tucked beneath his arm, and wept. Not the composed, rehearsed grief of the eulogy he had once delivered so beautifully for the woman he had killed, but something raw and childlike and entirely real, the grief, perhaps, of a boy who had spent 61 years running from a truth that had finally, inevitably, caught him. The constable came within the hour, summoned quietly by Miss Marple's own brief word to Dr. Haydock, and Gerald Whitmore was led away not in handcuffs, for he offered no resistance whatsoever, but simply walking, upright still from long habit, out through his own gate and down the lane past the church whose bells had just begun, with terrible ordinary indifference, to ring the 8 o'clock service. Miss Marple walked back to Rose Cottage that afternoon, though there was no longer any true reason for her to do so, and found the small grey cat waiting upon the doorstep as it had taken to doing these past weeks, and sat with it a while in the cooling autumn garden, beneath the apple tree, in the very chair where Agnes Pruitt had drawn her last breath. The truth, she reflected, stroking the cat's soft head as the light softened toward evening, had arrived exactly when it was meant to arrive, not too late after all, whatever the letter's own poor timing might have suggested, for it had reached London safely, had reached the solicitors, and, in time, would reach the courts, and set the record straight regardless of what became of Gerald Whitmore now. The tragedy was not, in the end, that the truth had come too late to save Agnes. It was that it had come, for Gerald, decades too late, to save him from the lie he had built his whole self upon. A lie that might, had he only found the courage to lay it down himself, years before, have cost him far less than the murder he committed to protect it. Secrets, Miss Marple thought, watching the last light fade gold and grey across the little garden, do not truly protect the people who keep them. They only borrow time, at compounding and terrible interest, from a reckoning that always, eventually comes due, and it is very often not the guilty who pay the first installment, but the innocent, gentle souls, like poor Agnes, who simply wished, at the very last, to set an old wrong right. She rose at last as the church bell tolled the hour, gathered the small cat into her basket for want of anywhere better for it to go, and walked home through the deepening dusk of St. Mary Mellow, where the lamps were being lit one by one in cottage windows, ordinary and warm, and where the village, in time, would learn to speak of Colonel Whitmore only in low voices, and would slowly, inevitably, return to its own quiet rhythms, as villages always did, she reflected, folding grief and scandal alike, eventually into the soft, forgiving soil of memory. But she, at least, would not soon forget the tremor of a hand upon a coffin, nor the small scorched fragment of a crest that refused to burn away entirely, nor the quiet, extraordinary courage of an old postmistress who had walked 3 miles alone to set right, at the very last, a wrong she had carried silently for 23 years, and had paid, in the end, the full and terrible price of finally telling the truth.